Good morning, and welcome to this first of two sessions on health. The first session will be focusing on COVID-19, and the second session will be dealing with the issues of global governance and health. As you, I'm sure, realize, COVID-19 is the worst combined health and socioeconomic crisis in living memory. In a little less than 3 years, COVID-19 has infected at least 250 million people across the world and generated a global death toll estimated to be 14 to 17 million people. At the highest point of the epidemic, 90% of children across the world were unable to attend school. And an output of $22 trillion is expected to be lost in the period 2020 to 2025, the deepest shock to the global economy since World War II. By November 2022, at least 125 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty because of the pandemic. And the pandemic is not over. As we speak, hospitalizations are increasing again, at least in Europe and in the US. And the pandemic continues to have a profound impact on lives and livelihoods as economy slowly begins to take place in terms of recovery in at least wealthiest countries, but still falters in low-income countries, as we have been discussing even in the previous session. This is the third time we address COVID-19 at the World Policy Conference. The first event was virtual in 2020. Some of you may have attended it. Then we had a session last year, and some of the speakers this year are speakers who were with us in 2021. And now we're meeting again almost 3 years after the first case of pneumonia due to an unknown new pathogen were identified in Wuhan, China. So there are 3 aims to our session today. The first is to discuss the current pandemic situation and whether epidemiological scenarios can be built for the short and mid-term. And we'll hear from Professor Antoine Flahault, who is the director of the Institute of Global Health at the University of Geneva. Then we will hear 3 regional perspectives and how lessons from the pandemic are being learned in different regions. In Africa, from Dr. Juliette Twakli, Chief Medical Officer at Family Child Associates in Accra, Ghana. In the United Emirates, from Dr. Maha Taysir Barakat, Director General of the Frontline Heroes Office in the United Emirates. And in China, from Yide Chao, Secretary General of the Shanghai Development Research Foundation. And we will close considering how other pandemic threats can arise anytime, particularly from the increasing opportunities of animal-human contacts at global level. And we'll hear from Professor Christian Bréchot from the University of South Florida and President of the Global Virus Network. So I believe we can now start, and I'll give the floor to Professor Antoine Flahault. Antoine.
Merci Michel. Si je peux avoir ma première diapositive. on va essayer de tirer quelques leçons de cette pandémie, et en particulier si on veut donner aujourd'hui la situation internationale. La première chose qu'on peut dire, c'est que les données sont assez fragmentaires, même si elles nous arrivent en temps réel ou quasi réel, et que de façon assez unique, on peut en effet tenter de modéliser et de vouloir prédire l'évolution de cette pandémie. Force est de constater qu'il est très difficile de la prédire, même au-delà de 7 jours. Nous ne pouvons par exemple pas dire aujourd'hui si le 15 décembre, la France aura atteint le pic de sa 9e vague. On peut penser que les données de Chine sont trompeuses aujourd'hui, assez sous-notifiées. La sous-notification affecte pratiquement tous les continents. La deuxième leçon qu'on peut tirer, et qui est peut-être pas aussi connue que cela, est une très grande synchronisation du phénomène épidémique dans le monde. Lorsqu'une vague émerge quelque part, en Europe, toute l'Europe est atteinte, mais plus que cela, par exemple, aujourd'hui, cette 9e vague dont on parle en Europe atteint également les États-Unis, le Canada, l'Amérique latine, mais aussi l'Asie, le Japon et, par exemple, la Chine, comme on vient de le dire. Au moment de la vague Delta, il y avait 80% des pays qui étaient en croissance pandémique également. Troisième leçon, qui paraît connue de tous, le SARS-CoV-2 a une transmission aérosol, quasi exclusive. Aujourd'hui, on le sait, très peu de contamination manuportée, très peu de contamination directe. L'immense majorité des contaminations rapportées se fait dans des lieux clos, mal ventilés, bondés et dans des transports publics. On le sait, mais on n'a toujours pas vraiment tiré les leçons de cela. Il y a d'énormes travaux d'infrastructure du bâti pour rendre mieux ventilé, mieux aéré, avec des normes modernes de construction, ce qui ne va pas sans problème avec la crise énergétique, mais aussi avec la volonté de réduire l'empreinte carbone, car le renouvellement de l'air peut avoir son coût collatéral associé. La quatrième leçon est peut-être la moins connue de tous. La pollution atmosphérique aux particules fines, celle qui est due dans nos villes, nos milieux urbains, à la combustion des énergies fossiles, mais aussi celle qui est due au sable du désert, beaucoup plus familier ici, mais qui aussi affecte les pays d'Europe et qui entraîne ces fines particules entraînent une forme d'abrasion du système, de l'épithélium du système respiratoire, qu'il soit supérieur ou même bas, parce que ce sont des particules très fines, et peut entraîner et est associé à une augmentation et de la fréquence et de la gravité des épidémies de Covid. Ça a été très bien démontré dès le tout début de la pandémie, au moment de l'émergence en Lombardie, zone très polluée d'Europe pour sa pollution atmosphérique de l'épidémie, mais aussi en région parisienne, à Londres, où ça a été étudié, mais ça a été montré également au Brésil, en Amazonie, avec les feux de forêt, ça a été montré également en Inde en particulier. Essayons de voir, puisqu'on ne peut pas les prédire, les différents scénarios qui se présentent à nous pour cet hiver qui va venir et pour la suite de cette pandémie. Le premier scénario est un scénario qu'on pouvait élaborer encore il y a 15 jours. C'était un scénario très optimiste, se dire mais dans le fond, tout redescend, on n'a jamais été aussi bas dans les niveaux d'incidence mondiaux de la pandémie, l'accalmie va peut-être même se prolonger et qui sait, nous n'aurons peut-être pas de nouveaux variants qui va déferler sur le monde. Malheureusement, déjà aujourd'hui, on voit que ce scénario se ferme et que ce ne sera pas le scénario le plus optimiste qui va nous arriver. Le scénario qui paraît être celui qui survient aujourd'hui, c'est celui du business as usual, c'est celui du scénario d'un nouveau variant, on l'appelle en Europe le BQ11, aux États-Unis, au Canada le BQ11, mais à Singapour ou au Japon le XBB, peu importe, un nouveau variant vient et efface la circulation des précédents variants. C'était BA5, ça avait été BA4, mais avant Omicron, vous vous souvenez, ça avait été Delta, ça avait été Alpha. On connaît la série de ces vagues pandémiques. Le troisième scénario est plus problématique parce qu'il correspond à cette soupe de variants qui n'est pas que BQ11, qui est en réalité aujourd'hui plus de 500 sous-variants descendants d'Omicron, une très grande famille où un certain nombre d'entre eux sont comme tapis à nos portes, prêts à attaquer à nouveau, sans même laisser de répit. On voit dans les dernières données d'hier soir de l'ONS du Royaume-Uni qu'en réalité, on ne connaît plus d'accalmie. Il y a une sorte de plateau permanent, de circulation permanente de Covid dans nos populations, dans nos sociétés, laissant leurs traces, saturant peut-être plus les hôpitaux grâce à la vaccination, mais laissant une très forte tension hospitalière et un très grand nombre de Covid longs, ces formes post-infectieuses, particulièrement préoccupantes parce que souvent handicapantes de Covid, qui feraient constituer une sorte de permanence de cette pandémie. Il faut juste savoir aujourd'hui que la mortalité due au Covid reste en Europe parmi les 3 premières causes de mortalité de l'Europe. Donc encore en 2022, en Europe comme aux États-Unis, où les données sont fiables, on voit qu'on a une mortalité par Covid qui reste très préoccupante. Le 4e scénario, c'est celui de la Chine qui s'éveille à sa stratégie qui n'est plus la stratégie zéro Covid. On ne sait pas très bien jusqu'à quel point la Chine va abandonner sa stratégie de suppression, qu'on appelle zéro Covid, ou la stratégie d'élimination du virus. Ce que l'on peut dire, c'est que Hong Kong a tenté, il y a exactement 9 mois, en mars dernier, lorsque Omicron est arrivé, a tenté de faire un peu comme les autres pays d'Asie et du Pacifique et du monde, d'abandonner sa stratégie zéro Covid, mais a constaté une hécatombe. C'est-à-dire que ce n'est pas le sous-variant Omicron qui est si peu virulent que cela, c'est le vaccin qui fait que Omicron est rendu peu virulent. Or, les Hongkongais, comme les Chinois, sont bien vaccinés, sauf pour leurs personnes âgées. Les personnes de plus de 80 ans, à Hong Kong, il y a un an, ou en Chine aujourd'hui, pour 60% d'entre eux ne sont pas correctement vaccinés. Être correctement vacciné par les vaccins chinois, c'est avoir reçu 3 doses. On a trop dit que les vaccins chinois ne seraient pas efficaces. Ça n'est pas vrai, ça a été bien documenté par les autorités de Hong Kong qui ont vu que lorsque l'on avait 2 doses de vaccins chinois, on était en effet moins bien protégé qu'avec 2 doses de vaccins ARN messager. Mais lorsque l'on a 3 doses de vaccins chinois, on est aussi bien protégé qu'avec 3 doses de vaccins ARN messager. Donc il faut 3 doses, mais 60% des plus de 80 ans n'ont pas 3 doses de vaccin en Chine aujourd'hui. Les modélisations qui ont essayé de transposer cette Chine miniature, qui était le cas de Hong Kong en mars dernier, à la Chine continentale aujourd'hui, laisse penser qu'il pourrait y avoir entre 1 et 2 millions de décès si la levée de la stratégie de zéro Covid est trop brutale en Chine en ce moment. Donc ça, c'est une inconnue. La deuxième inconnue qui va avec cela et qui concerne le monde entier, c'est quels seront les nouveaux variants qui vont émerger de cette soupe dont on a parlé tout à l'heure si 1,4 milliard de Chinois, en moins d'un an, se retrouvent infectés par un nouveau coronavirus. Ne seront-ils pas dans une situation beaucoup plus proche de celle que nous avons connue dans les premiers mois de la pandémie, où nous avons vu émerger alpha, delta, bêta, gamma, d'autres variants. Donc ce ne sera pas nécessairement Omicron qui va faire de nouveaux petits dans l'émergence qui pourrait se produire. En conclusion, nous avons eu 2 vagues en 2020. Vous vous souvenez, la surprise, l'effroi même. Et puis aussi des mesures du Moyen-Âge. Confinement, quarantaine, couvre-feu. Tout cela a été supprimé en 2021 rapidement grâce à l'arrivée de 12 vaccins sur le marché mondial. On est arrivé dans l'ère moderne, on a combattu avec des vaccins cette pandémie. Mais en 2022, on voit une accélération de la pandémie. Ça n'est plus 2 vagues, c'est 5 vagues que nous connaissons rien que dans l'année 2022. Une accélération qui entraîne une fatigue chez tout le monde, la fatigue pandémique, mais qui les politiques également veulent tourner la page. Elle concerne absolument tout le monde. Que se passera-t-il en 2023? Combien de vagues? Lequel des 4 scénarios ou un 5e dont nous venons de parler? Quels variants vont émerger? Quel impact? Quelles leçons aurons-nous retenues? C'est cela dont nous allons continuer de parler. Merci de votre attention.
Merci beaucoup Antoine d'avoir en quelque sorte set the scene, je ne sais plus entre le français et l'anglais comment m'exprimer. Nous reviendrons sur plusieurs points que tu as soulevés, en particulier celui de la circulation permanente du virus à laquelle nous allons être confrontés. Mais j'aimerais maintenant que nous nous tournions donc vers le monde région par région, en quelque sorte, pour entendre 3 perspectives régionales. And the next speaker would be Juliette Touakli, giving us a perspective from Africa and the African continent. Juliette.
Good morning. Thank you. We learned several lessons from the COVID pandemic in Africa, not the least from observing what was happening elsewhere and looking into our own resources. And one of the major lessons, I believe, was a recognition of the need for strong political will and a focus on in-country public health systems. There was also a greater unity of purpose between countries in Africa. Yes, certainly there was a regional emphasis, but there was also a Pan-African approach, which I think also was very helpful to us in the medical arena. There was certainly a recognition of the need to build our own capacities, which thankfully was supported by international agencies' decision to build up African vaccine responses as a global public good. And of course, as many of you may remember, this was partly in response to the disappointment in how vaccines had been promised and often not delivered. We received barely a third of the promised vaccines ultimately. And so there was a very rapid recognition of the need to change course. That was supported. And very strong support from the African CDC that was located in Addis Ababa. And we were very fortunate in having very strong leadership of that institution through a Dr. John Nkengasong, who was the director of it at that time. He was absolutely magnificent. Unfortunately, because he was so magnificent, he's now been swiped up by the US government to manage PEPFAR, but still he has a worthy successor in place. And the CDC, the African CDC, harmonized and strengthened surveillance systems in a way that we had not experienced previously, as well as strategic sampling frameworks, which was very important for identifying the different variants as they arose throughout the continent. He also focused on strengthening the supply chain once it had been developed, or once it became apparent for the need to develop a strong supply chain of various goods, and shared surveillance data across all country, or all in-country programs. And you may remember after the B1 Omicron variant had been recognized in South Africa, we were given daily, if not twice daily, accounts of its gradual migration upward from Southern Africa to East Africa, West, up through North Africa, which allowed us to prepare adequately, at least to some extent as it made that transmission across the continent. And number two, vaccine production facilities were developed. There were some incipient facilities available, but they have been considerably strengthened and enhanced. Across 6 African countries, we have 12 facilities that are based primarily in Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Senegal, Rwanda, and South Africa. And these have been particularly effective and particularly strong in their output. We also, not we, but in Africa, there was a group, African Vaccine Acquisition Trust, established, AVAT, that not only has focused on the manufacture of vaccines, but also manufacturing tests, treatments, and protective equipment, even though each country, of course, took on what they could locally. And certainly Ghana was very busy in this regard. The CDC also ensured that there was the development of an Africa medical access supply chain for pharmaceuticals. This is currently based in Rwanda and has been very, very effective because of the impactful funding and support from many bodies that have included the African Union, the African Development Bank, PEPFAR, and WHO, to mention but a few. I think it's shown that we have worked together as a collective insofar as we have already been faced with our new pandemic. Well, it's not quite a pandemic, I take that back. Our new illness, i.e. Ebola, which showed up initially in West Africa and Sierra Leone, and then subsequently in Uganda, where it's been a little bit more severe. But I think it is coming under control, not the least because of this group work together, especially by our in-country public health systems. And so I think we've really learned to work together, if you will, finally, in an important aspect of our development, that being health, and politically, insofar as it's been necessary to work in the public health arena. But I'm quite proud of how we responded overall, and I do think we're well prepared for future outbreaks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juliette. I think we'll come back to Africa and to regions in the next session, because clearly what we're seeing now is a welcome trend to decentralization and the regionalization of manufacturing, research and development and manufacturing. And that has implication when we will be discussing the governance and whether sort of governance of health in the future, how much will that be global at the New York or Geneva level, or how much will that be a sort of federation of regional governance hubs, and how much regions in the future will be autonomous in their ability to prepare and to respond to pandemics. Let's now move to the EMRO region. Dr. Barakat, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today to participate in this panel. So I think following on from the talks that we've just heard, the WHO Eastern Mediterranean region consists of 21 countries and 1 territory. And within the EMRO region, there were 23 million cases of COVID during the pandemic, and a reported 348,000 deaths. Of course, we believe this is an underestimate. There are certain countries that weren't fully at capacity in terms of their ability to test, diagnose, and to manage the cases. So we suspect the numbers are greater in the Eastern Mediterranean region. And if you allow me to go into the UAE as a specific example, And then we can explain how within the UAE there were initiatives that helped other regions in EMRO, other countries. So within the United Arab Emirates, where you are today, the population is approximately 10 million people. And in the last almost 3 years, we've had 1 million cases of COVID diagnosed by PCR, of whom, unfortunately, 2,348 passed away. So that gives us a kind of average case fatality ratio of around 0.2%. The way that the country dealt with the pandemic, so the UAE's response, had several pillars in it. But if we can concentrate on some of the most important, and I would say the most important one, was wise leadership at the highest level. So a governance at the highest level that was able to coordinate the national response. So the whole of government response, the whole of society response, all coordinated in a seamless manner. I think all too often we see cases where resources may be available, but something goes wrong with the governance or the leadership, and you don't get the optimum outcome. So I think leadership is extremely important. Other pillars to the response, obviously the infection prevention and control program nationally, that's comprehensive, robust, protecting the most vulnerable, protecting frontline workers. You have, I'd say the third pillar is laboratory testing. If you can't diagnose it accurately and quickly, you lose the ability to fight COVID. You know, when you can diagnose it urgently within 24 hours, you can implement your isolation and preventive measures much more effectively. The UAE actually conducted 200 million tests, PCR tests, in the last 3 years. That's 20 times the size of the population. So on average, an individual would have had over 20 tests on average. Then comes vaccination. So no country could have protected itself against hospitalization and mortality without an effective vaccination program. And the UAE started clinical trials on vaccination as early as summer 2020. By September, there was emergency use of vaccination. And by June 2022, the United Arab Emirates had achieved 100% of its target of vaccination of its target groups. I think this is really a key component of a country's ability to reduce hospitalizations and death. Furthermore, last year, the construction started on a local vaccine manufacturing plant that will produce 200 million doses of vaccines. And again, this goes back to the Emirates region and Africa and other countries that are in need. These 200 million doses every year will go to support not just the UAE, but the region and other countries in the world. There are other pillars, and if I can, in the interest of time, maybe just concentrate on one more, which is urgent and critical resource mobilization. So both in terms of prioritizing domestic budget towards COVID, getting equipment mobilized and supplied to hospitals where they need it, and of course human resource. How do you mobilize a team at urgent times in very short with very short notice? The question is who are these people? Who makes up the front line? The UAE is unique in that His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed launched the Frontline Heroes Office in June 2020 dedicated to looking after all frontline workers in the country, to champion them, to listen to their needs, to support them. And the office set up a registry. The registry has now 135,000 files for each frontline worker. We know their individual circumstances, their personal needs. The office has supported them with education for themselves, for their children, with health needs, physical and mental health support. It's worked with the central bank to try ease the stress of repaying loans. And for those that are expatriates, they've given them golden visas to help retain them and support them in the country. And for the category of frontline workers that have sacrificed the most, those that have died, we call them the fallen heroes. The office actually has adopted their children and spouses. We look after them. We make sure they have their schooling covered, their healthcare covered, their housing covered. So we don't forget those that have sacrificed the most. And I think my final point is it's not enough just to look within your own country. The United Arab Emirates was one of the first to help internationally, and in the course of the pandemic, over 2,000 tons of medical aid has been distributed to 135 countries. Mr. Chairman, I think in summary, if you ask me what was the most important element of the UAE's response, or any other countries, I would say wise leadership. You need wise leadership to coordinate national efforts and to help with urgent and critical resource mobilization. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that focus on healthcare, frontline healthcare workers. I must say I'm not aware of any other country that would have set up a special office dedicated to healthcare workers, reporting basically to the highest level of government. Maybe before we move to Yide Chao, Juliette, can I turn to you and ask you what's the current status, what's the current vaccine coverage of healthcare workers in Africa? That was an issue, of course, in the first year of the pandemic.
Well, as you know, we did have an initial problem with accessing the vaccines, and then we had a political problem of which vaccines we would encourage per country and within certain countries and regions. But I would say that right now, and I'm not basing it on very specific facts, but certainly anecdotally, I would say that most healthcare workers, perhaps 60% thereabouts, have been vaccinated, because I think we were put into the position of having to recommend vaccination to populations that were somewhat skeptical about the need for them, were skeptical about the onset and origin of COVID and their own exposure rates to it, because as you know, notwithstanding the discrepancy of numbers of cases, I do think that Africa still did come in a little bit lower in terms of active cases and mortality. And so I think that there was a moral imperative for those involved in health to take the vaccine themselves and then persuade the citizenry, if you will, especially high-risk citizenry, to vaccinate.
Thank you very much. Can I now turn to you, Yide, with a view from China and on China?
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I have to say I'm not an expert on public health like other members of this panel. I guess because I'm the only Chinese in person at the WPC, so organizer want to double my assignment.
That's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders.
But anyway, as an observer, as someone gone through lockdown in China in past 3 years, I would like to share my view on what's going on in China, what experience and the lesson can learn from China to deal with future X disease or unknown violence. First of all, I guess being transparency should be the first principle of the unknown virus or X disease in the future. Here I mean the virus origin, gene composition, evolution of a virus, and its possible harm on the human being, etc., should be released. All this information should be released to the public, government department, and the CDC on time. I understand there is a controversy on whether the Chinese government do enough on this area. Honestly, I'm not positioned to make a judgment on the issue. But the one factor I wanted to raise here, actually the one professor at the Fudan University in Shanghai published the gene composition on the internet. That enables to other company in Western to produce PCR testing material to produce a vaccine very soon. Without his release, it's hard to imagine in short period of time vaccine can be produced. Secondly, the action should be taken quickly. I want to use the term yesterday, rapidity of action. That's also very important. When local authority find an unknown virus, they should immediately report to national CDC, while national CDC should immediately report to WHO according to the retired procedure. In case of China, I have to say the local government had been a little bit slow to quickly report case to national CDC. That's the lesson, I guess, we should take it. Third point is physical separation and its extreme form, lockdown, is effective at the beginning to prevent expansion of virus. At the beginning, it's effective. The earlier it take, the more effective would be, and the small its scope could be. In the beginning of 2020, Chinese government shut down the Wuhan city. Wuhan is the capital of Hubei province. That lockdown in early 2020 was a successful example. It helped much less case occurred in China in that year relative to other countries. It also helped China become only one of large economy which get a positive GDP growth in 2020. The fourth point, first lesson, I guess, the flexibility and the sensibility are necessary to deal with variation of virus. Different measures should be taken to different variation. A past successful measure doesn't mean a future success. In China, I guess at the beginning, they did a good job. But starting from this year, I guess Chinese government has been slow to reaction of Omicron. The Omicron occurred in China December of last year. It takes several months at least. Chinese government should understand the nature of Omicron. They should not continue to take zero COVID policy until recently. I guess they lift the restriction immediately in past 1 or 2 weeks. That's fortunately for Chinese, also fortunately for Chinese people, because in past several months, China went through very tough time. The cost is very high. The economy slowed down. But now the policy has been changed. We will see what happens in near future. The last point is the awareness public on the virus or X disease are also very important. I came here a little bit earlier due to the availability of a flight. I met some staff, a Bank of China here in UAE. They told me very interesting case. One staff originally came from Wuhan. In January 16, 2020, his family, including his parents, wife, 2 kids, from Wuhan fly to Dubai. He read some article in newspapers. He knows something happened, but he doesn't know the detail. But he very smart. He keep all of family members stay at home, don't go outside. But later on, one by one, some symptoms appear. First of all, he sent his mom to the hospital here. The doctor checked it, no answer. They don't know what's going on here. They came back. All midnight, the doctor and the nurse came to their home because they do some PCR testing. They found some virus. Then whole family be moved to the hospital, quarantine. So he proudly to me, he said, yes, we brought the virus to UAE, but we never infect anyone here in UAE. That's a very good example. Now, what happened in China? I guess Chinese government should do more on public understand what's going on. Otherwise, it will create serious consequence. Might be the wave will occur in China. I guess Chinese governments will start to do that. I just stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for emphasizing from the start how China very, very early on made the sequence of the virus available. That, if I remember well, was on January 2nd, 2020. I mean, within days after the first cases were reported to WHO. That had not been the case with some other viruses in the history. But this issue of sharing sequences is clearly one of the key issues of the ongoing negotiations of a new pandemic treaty at international level. So, you know, within the new field of health diplomacy, there's a subfield of genomic sequence sharing diplomacy nowadays. Maybe before we move to Christian, can I ask Antoine to say a few words about the other countries that went into lockdowns very early on in the pandemic? Because, of course, we saw 2 patterns in the first months of 2020. Countries that had experienced SARS in the past, China, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, to some extent Australia, New Zealand, went directly in and reacted very fast with strict measures, whereas many other countries across the world, including in Europe and the US, sort of waited until March 10 or March 15, 2020, before they would put in measures in place. So how did the transition, and when did that transition to a more liberal system occurred in those countries? And how much, maybe then Ide, you could react, how much could that serve as a model for the transition that you mentioned is now occurring in China?
Yeah, you go ahead.
No.
You go ahead.
Yeah.
Antoine,
In fact, you remember my slide where I mentioned that Hong Kong in March 22 had experienced a huge wave with a high mortality. At the same time, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan did not experience such a wave of mortality, but they experienced, as we did, a huge wave of COVID, of Omicron, of COVID-19. So they quit their zero COVID strategy in early 2022 just because they thought Omicron was mild. But in addition to that, they had a high level of vaccine coverage, more than 80%, like in Europe. And so they thought they could now really face the Omicron wave because they were vaccinated enough. Hong Kong thought that too, but that was not true due to the low coverage of elderly, of the 80+ person.
Yeah, I guess you are right.
And sorry, maybe could you also say a few words about the current acceptance of the virus by people over the age, let's say, of 65 or 70
of the vaccine,
in China?
Yeah, I guess you are right. Several Eastern Asia countries did similar things, lockdown at the beginning of 2020. But now you are right, they transfer to another model, another panel. Interestingly, what happened in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong have a close relation with the mainland China, but finally they changing the model. Actually, we as an organization, I have a good contact with the professor of a medical school of Hong Kong University. He showed his view to experience what happened in Hong Kong. He said to me, actually, Xinhua News Agency asked him to write a report, which sent to central government of China. What I try to say, what happened in other countries have some impact on the changing of Chinese government policy on zero COVID policy. That's my feeling. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can Christian, let me now turn to you. Is the next pandemic tonight?
Thank you, Michel, and thank you, Thierry de Montbrial, for this invitation. 4 points. First, surveillance. Will we face new pandemics? Yes. Can we predict these pandemics? No. So surveillance is key. We are still struggling with COVID-19. That's the topic of the conversation. But at the same time, we have been witnessing monkeypox, some bursts of Marburg, and resurgence of Ebola. So the problem is not to predict. We cannot do it. The problem is early detection of the warning signals. And we have to recognize that on COVID-19, we have, at least in part, failed. How can we improve? A main point is to focus on the interface between humans and animals. We are all of us aware that most of these epidemics stem from contaminations of humans by animals. This is where we need to concentrate the effort, not to disperse. And this seems obvious, but this is not at all what has been done in most geographical areas. Surveillance means early detections. It also means evaluating the long-term impact of a viral infection. And I really believe, and Antoine has alluded to it, that long COVID is potentially a major challenge. And what is new is that now we have, for the first time, for a few months, longitudinal prospective studies of cohorts of a high number of individuals in a relatively homogeneous environment. And the figures show that about 30 to 50% of individuals infected by the Beta and Delta variants will show at least one symptom of COVID-19 at 6 months, and about 20%, 1 out of 5, at 18 months. The good news is that the figures are much lower with Omicron and Omicron-related variants and likely vaccination. We are talking about 15 to 18%. But considering the huge number of infected individuals, this is very significant. So this only emphasizes the need for these surveillance mechanisms to be tightly connected to local and regional health systems. Second, reinforcing local and regional capacities. This point has been well described by the previous speakers. I find it very striking that we have everything in hand. We have modern epidemiology, bioinformatics, biostatistics. We know how to share data, to analyze them. We can analyze wastewater samples, and which provide an accurate and very early detection of an ongoing epidemic. And at the same time, we are not sufficiently efficient. We need to base all of this on local and regional capacities, and as it has been well described, it's about human resource, equipment, overall facilities. Third, reactivity and innovation. We all know the huge success of vaccine. It's about innovation for solving a problem, when a virus is detected, when a problem is identified. And we can do better for vaccines, but in particular for antivirals and diagnostics. So it's really about consortia, networks, problem solvings of academics and industrial partners with novel approach to intellectual property regulations and financial incentives. And also, I personally believe that diagnostics has been very much underappreciated in this crisis. There is a huge progress which has not been translated enough to the daily life. So again, this is about consortia and financial incentive. Also, I believe, it's obvious, we need to embrace these problems in a real comprehensive view. It's about global and One Health, merging human and animal health. But it's also about taking in consideration environment and also nutrition. Nutrition is a key factor, and in particular through microbiomes. Fourth point, novel schemes of organization. That point will be taken in the next session, but really we need much more flexible networks, consortia of individuals. Again, merging industrials and academics, problem solving, science-driven, independent, also including education and training of the next generation of virologists. And the Global Virus Network is an example, but there are many others. Other networks will be created. It will be key to coordinate these efforts. This is entirely feasible with significant financial incentive, but very much worth compared to the impact of such a crisis. So to conclude, it's about surveillance, it's about local and regional capacities, it's about innovation and reactivity, it's about a comprehensive view of the problem, and it's about novel schemes of organizations and flexible networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. And you pointed out this key issue of preparedness. One of the first lessons that we learned from COVID-19 was that the world was not prepared, and that investments in preparedness have been much too low over the years. And then also the way we thought we would measure the preparedness of a country actually proved to be wrong. So there is a so-called global preparedness index, and that index showed that the US among the best prepared countries in the world. But then this is one of the countries that failed totally in responding to the pandemic. So we need not only to invest strongly in preparedness now with all of these, including this science and industry and other networks that Christian mentioned, but we need to totally revise the way we monitor preparedness and our indicators. With that, we have a few minutes for discussion. So what I suggest is that we take the questions and then I'll ask my colleagues to answer the questions they'd like to address. So let's start with Masoud. Yep.
Thank you very much, Michel. First of all, let me just say it's a terrific panel. And I really want to thank all of you for your interventions. I hope we can make the slides available that were used by Professor Flano as well. I have one question for you, and it picks up from your last comment, Michel, which is, how well do you think we are prepared for the next pandemic if it were to strike us in the next 12 months? One thing about COVID is that we developed a vaccine that works within a year, faster than at any time in history. No guarantee that we will be able to do it for the next pandemic. And the mortality rate was quite low, less than 5%. And that, again, no guarantee that the next pandemic will have a low mortality rate. So you just identified, Christian, what is needed. And the question I have for all of you is, how much progress have we made globally and regionally to be prepared if the next pandemic were to hit us within the next 18 months?
Thank you, Masoud. That will also be discussed in the next session. Monsieur Mariton?
Yes, two quick questions. Does the panel draw any lesson from the difference in policies, even in Western Europe, for example, the difference between Sweden and France, for example, no lockdown, at least during the first weeks or even month in Sweden, and going beyond Europe, a complete different policy in Australia, for example. So these vast differences in the Western world, what sort of lesson would you draw from that? Second question is on the refusal of vaccination. The refusal of vaccination can be regional, problems in Africa, but also problems in some parts of French overseas territories, and now some sort of sequential refusal of vaccination. For example, the low level of vaccination in France presently for the new repeats of the vaccination that are required are not actually carried particularly by the elderly. So what's the answer to some sort of fatigue as to vaccination?
Thank you. Yes, next to you.
Thanks, Christian, for sharing valuable information. My question is how artificial intelligence will help in checking COVID-19 in future? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And there are two more questions, and then we'll stop it now. Monsieur Dessous, so three questions.
Yeah,
please be brief.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much. While I agree, I mean, we are a think tank that does a lot of work on virus and the growth of it for about 20 years. So the question is more on, while we accept the premise of zoonotic diseases, I just wanted your insights, especially Christian, on the gain for function, where these researchers are outsourced to labs outside, and the strong belief that we have, and some intelligence and information we have, that the Wuhan was not an accident, because we had a discussion with the Wuhan medical officer soon after the virus, that it may have been an accident that came out of the lab. So how do you, at a global level, prevent this? Because if you do that, the way to stop it and the cure will be extremely difficult.
Thank you.
You know that Israel had been, in a way, a laboratory for developing the Pfizer immunity. As a matter of fact, we became to be like a laboratory for all the world. In Israel, it was not compulsory to take the vaccination, but of course it was possible to do it fast, because in Israel there is a special construction of the health system. People belong to one the branches, we have 3 or 4 companies which deal with health, and every person, every family belongs to one of them. So it was very easy to arrive to most of the people. And it works. Now, one of the questions that I have about this immunization and this COVID is there are a lot of people who were spreading up in Israel and all over the world that you don't have to be vaccinated, that's wrong, that's have a lot of all kind of, in my opinion, rubbish. And it is really, a lot of people accept their own opinion and refuse to be vaccinated. The fact is that when we canceled the closure in Israel, so we were in a very bad situation because people who had been vaccinated were okay, but the people who didn't vaccinated would come also to the centers, etc., and make people to be, again, having what do you think about the possibility to make it compulsory? Last question, second question is, do you think that then in the future, the mRNA vaccinations would work also for other problems in the world, like cancer, etc.?
Yeah. Thank you very much for this futuristic outlook. And yes, Israel is a sort of living clinical trial cohort on COVID-19, and the data from Israel is the most precious at population level. Monsieur Dossou, very briefly, s'il vous plaît, car nous allons être en retard. On va prendre 5 minutes pour les réponses.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est presque une consultation personnelle, profitant de la qualité de ce panel.
Mais le secret médical...
Non, c'est public. Puis c'est une pandémie. Je suis pleinement octogénaire. J'ai déjà pris 4 fois le vaccin et j'étais admissible à la 5e fois il y a 2 mois. Et puis on m'a dit non, c'est pas encore sûr, ne prends pas. Donc j'ai hésité. Alors ma question concrète, puis-je aller directement en partant d'ici au 5e vaccin, 5e fois? Oui. Voilà. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Voilà.
Merci beaucoup. And
Merci.
I think this is I'd like either Antoine or Christian to address this, because that relates to your point, Antoine, of either continuing waves or continuing ongoing circulation of what we now call a soup of variants. And as we face that, and as we know that immunity is waning in people aged, let's say, over 70 within 4 to 5 months, and that was shown in Israel with the last booster, what does that imply in terms of continuous boosters? Let's start with this question, and I'll then ask, let's have Antoine and Christian react. Then I'd like to turn to Juliette, Ide, and Maha for just the final points.
Bon, pour la question du vaccin, clairement, on a aujourd'hui un vaccin qui n'est pas dangereux, qui est très bien toléré. En particulier chez les personnes âgées, il ne fait même pas de réaction réactogénique. Et donc, conseiller un nouveau rappel pour toute personne qui n'a pas eu de rappel dans les 6 mois qui précèdent me semble être de bonne politique. Il n'y a pas de niveau de preuve majeur aujourd'hui sur le plan scientifique parce que les fabricants courent derrière les variants en permanence et n'ont pas le temps de mettre en place des essais cliniques formels aussi puissants que ceux qui avaient été faits au départ. Mais on peut aujourd'hui raisonnablement recommander une dose vaccinale à toute personne éligible au vaccin qui n'a pas eu de dose depuis 6 mois. Et puis, pardon, vas-y.
Non.
Christian?
No, just to follow up on this on a more general basis, and this goes with the question in Israel. We have RNA-based vaccines. They are being adjusted to other viruses, possibly on cancer, but this is another story. The problem of these vaccines is that they do not generate a strong cellular immune response. So this is why there is still very much ongoing research on other vaccines for the future, which would provide longer lasting memory. But for the time being, we have this. It can be adjusted very rapidly to a new situation, and this is very valuable. But you must just take in consideration that there is, at the same time, a huge effort of novel vaccines. And I just take this opportunity for the question on artificial intelligence. This is very interesting because artificial intelligence is being tested on the data sharing. For example, long COVID, which is very multifactorial, very much beneficiate of this. But artificial intelligence can only be effective if you nurture it with the good data and with the accurate data. And then it always comes back to local and regional capacities. Otherwise, you are working on nothing.
Yeah, and one of the things that is currently being discussed is establishing at regional level across the world different hubs that would master some of the basic technologies, mRNA, and Juliette, you mentioned the hub in South Africa, but also adenovirus, based vaccines, also whole inactivated vaccines, because let's not remember, within 1 year, 2020, we saw the mRNA vaccines from the US and European industry. We saw the Chinese Sinopharm based on inactivated vaccines. We saw the adenoviral vaccines, AstraZeneca and Sputnik. We saw a Cuban vaccine, we saw an Indian vaccine. So within a year, the world, based on existing technological platforms, could innovate and bring effective vaccines. I'm not entering the discussion here of the relative efficacy, but thank you, Antoine, for making the point. And I'd like to make this clear because several people asked that question. 2 doses of Sinopharm plus 1 dose of Pfizer, or 3 doses of Sinopharm are equivalent to 3 doses of Pfizer, as far as we know at population level. Maybe a last turn of hearing the questions. Maybe Maha, would you say something?
Thank you. Clearly very important questions. And I reinforce the need for the strongest surveillance systems in every country. The next virus that may be predisposing to a pandemic could be in any country. Investment in surveillance systems and looking into the zoonotic side, so very much a One Health support. Countries need to invest in developing a strong One Health system. Thank you.
Thank you. Ide? Okay. No, we can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Okay. On peut avoir un micro pour Monsieur Chiao? Juliette.
I want to go back to something Christian said, almost in passing, about the relationship of humans and wild animals. Not just wild animals, but also the environment and our nutritional changes, the distortion of our nutritional changes. Increasingly, I do believe that there are huge impacts of focusing on our microbiomes through an increase in our plant-based intake within in our diets, and minimizing, if you will, distortion and destruction of our environments, wherein we then become exposed to wild animals with viruses that have been causing many of the pandemics we have been subject to over the past few decades. And I think that's only going to increase until we recognize that man has to be a little bit more circumspect in his relationship with the environment.
Yeah. Thank you. Ide.
Yeah, addressing the question how we should deal future X disease. As I said, I want to emphasize the most important thing is awareness of public. Yes, because it's an unknown virus, people don't know the detail, but they should understand, should know how to deal with these things. As Monitor pointed out, due to the SARS happened in Asia several years ago. That gives some awareness to public in Eastern Asia. They know something very seriously. That's I guess the point. Even we don't know the detail in future, but public should know how to deal with these unknown virus.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for the very good session, and see you in a minute.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.